Hello, and welcome to Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City, where we explore the history and people of Troy, New York, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, John Salka. Welcome back for part 2 of our chat with Mike Socio, Troy-based independent journalist, podcaster, and author of the brand new book, Morally Straight: How the Fight for LGBTQ Inclusion Changed the Boy Scouts and America, which documents the fight to end a decades-long ban on gay people from the then Boy Scouts of America. In part 2 of our chat, Mike shares his personal history with the Boy Scouts, the details of his Eagle Scout project, how he began his career in journalism, and where he sees the future of scouting in America following the most recent developments in the Boy Scouts' evolution as a youth organization to embrace inclusion. Mike also explains what he sees as the cyclical nature of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and legislation, and I briefly recap the final vote total by the Troy City Council on the annual LGBTQ Pride Month proclamation. Spoiler alert, it wasn't unanimous. Quickly, with a very humble request, if you could share this episode with your friends, family, or neighbors, that would be incredibly appreciated. Word of mouth is one of the biggest ways our show reaches new listeners. You can also find us on social media, so jump on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, YouTube, TikTok right now and search for us using @TroyStoryPod. Lastly, if you have an idea, suggestion for future guests, or some feedback on the show, feel free to drop us a line at mail@troystorypod.com. All right, that's it for the housekeeping part of the show. Let's get to part 2 of our interview with Mike Socio. In the book, it's also interesting to see how your early life bisected with the subjects in the book. You touched on this a little bit. The book itself is clearly not a memoir. It is very much like a deeply researched piece of journalism. But there certainly, your story weaves in and out at key moments, just, I think, to provide context for the reader. It dips into that first person language. Mm-hmm. Where you are explaining, okay, great, this is what was happening with me at this point in my life with scouting. So I kind of wanted to dive into your early life, where you grew up, sort of when you joined scouting. Is there like a story behind that? Any reason why you decided to join?
Yeah, so I grew up in the town of Middletown, New Jersey, and it's a commuter suburb of New York City, essentially along the Jersey Shore. And my brother, who's a few years older than me, had actually joined Cub Scouts first, and my mom signed him up. My mom was the den mother for Cub Scouts, and my brother kind of hated it. He quit after a year. And then when I was old enough, a couple years after, my mom just tried the same thing. She teamed up with some other moms. I think they were all from the PTA, essentially. And there were about 20 of us who were mostly like my friends from school anyway, who had a Cub Scout den. And there's really not much more to it. Like, that's how a lot of kids join at that age, and I just really liked it. Actually, we all did. Pretty much everyone made it through the whole Cub Scout program. We all crossed over, got the Arrow of Light, as you mentioned earlier. But the interesting thing was most of the people in my Cub Scout den actually didn't continue on into Boy Scouts, which I think is fairly common. And so I was one of, I think, 2 or 3 people who ended up actually continuing on into the program. And yeah, it just continued to be something I really loved. As a kid, I was not like the popular athletic type. I was pretty like artsy, and I didn't have a conception of my sexual orientation at that point, but I just always felt a little different. And scouting felt like a good place to channel that because I was good at advancing in the ranks. I was good at like accomplishing these little projects that you had to do. It just kind of made sense in my personality and with my skill set. And so that was the place where I poured a lot of my after school hours because it was one of my favorite activities.
Did you go to summer camp each summer? And do you remember where you went? What camp?
Of course, of course. So I went to 10 Mile River, which is actually in semi upstate New York. It's not, maybe we can argue about whether it's considered upstate, but back then it felt like it because I was coming from New Jersey. We drove a couple hours north. And it's part of the New York City Council's camps, actually. And it plays a role in the book, actually, too, because later on in the story, one of the gay Eagle Scouts gets hired at 10 Mile River as kind of a challenge to the Boy Scouts exclusionary policy. So anyway, it was a really great camp. I went there for 4 years. I was never on camp staff, but I did always love my time there. It was a really fantastic place.
Do you have like favorite memories from that time, or is there
Hmm.
any specific memory you have from Scout Camp that just really sticks out to you?
The memories of Scout Camp itself are not quite as vivid, I guess. But what I remember more were the special trips. So I write in the book about going to the Philmont Scout Ranch, which is this kind of scouting paradise out in New Mexico. And that trip really sticks out to me because it was the coolest thing I'd ever done, I think, at that point in my life. I was a freshman in high school and we got to go out and hike, 70 miles over the course of about a week. And we were carrying everything we needed to survive on our backs. And I was with a great group of other guys. And it was just really gorgeous out there. I mean, the scenery out in the Rocky Mountains was really cool. So that stands out as like the quintessential camping, hiking experience of my time as a youth.
What was your Eagle Scout project?
It's not terribly glamorous. I did what most of the kids in my troop did, which was a construction project. So our scout troop met at a local elementary school where I attended, and I wanted to give back to the school. So they had this like playground area with lots of equipment, and they needed like a storage space for it, essentially. So I built these storage containers where they could store all their stuff, and I designed them specifically for what they needed. So basically, the project was mostly actually on the front end of like designing it and fundraising it and getting the materials and all of that. And then over the course of about 3 days, in my driveway, I had a bunch of kids from the scout troop come over, and I directed them all on how to build the boxes because, as you know, when you're executing your Eagle Scout project, you're really not supposed to do any of the work yourself. It's more about the leadership. So yeah, completed it over the course of a summer, and then became an Eagle Scout that fall.
So to come back to the book and the Eagle Scout experience, the story of James Dale's Eagle Scout journey, I had to laugh at the consistency of the experience despite like the multi-decade difference in time, especially specifically the Eagle Scout ceremony. The description was identical.
Yeah, I felt the same way.
The rented hall, they pin the patch on, the speeches and the certificates, and then of course like the sheet
The
cake.
sheet cake, yes. You cannot have a court of honor without a sheet cake.
Just to get back to you, so you again you touch on a lot of this in the book, but you go you're obviously an independent journalist. You've done journalism for quite a bit now. What inspired you to your interest in doing journalism and some of the professional pursuits you do now?
Yeah, I started in journalism in high school, really, because my older brother, who we actually did not attend the same high school, but he was the editor of his school paper. And so he was like, you got to join the school paper. Like, that's what all the smart people do, learn how to write. And so I joined the school paper, but I actually at the time really didn't like writing. So I joined as a photographer. And that quickly became something I really loved. And by the end of high school, I'd been the photo editor. I went to college fully intending to be a photojournalist. And when I got to Boston University, declared a major in journalism, kind of focused on photo within that. So that was always my thing, was photography, actually. And it wasn't until kind of like the later half of college that the written part of journalism became more attractive to me. As part of my major, I had to take writing courses, of course. And then I realized writing gave me access to some stories that I couldn't access visually. One of which was the scouting story, actually, because I was writing about that in college as well. I wanted to dig deeper into the past to tell these different kinds of stories. And so writing got a little bit bigger, like as a piece of the pie. And my first real job out of college was at the Albany Business Review, actually. And they hired me as a digital editor. And that was kind of a grab bag of a position. And the beauty of it was it allowed me to combine a lot of these different interests. I was sometimes a photographer, sometimes a videographer, sometimes a writer, sometimes a reporter. It was a bit of everything, which I really loved. And I learned so much there. And one of the best parts of that job is I had this incredible editor who I'll shout out. His name is Mike Hendricks. He's been a local journalist at first for the Associated Press, then for the Business Review for many decades. And he really encouraged that writing side of me. He taught me how to write cover stories and longer stories. And that's kind of where it began. That's where I really started to see myself as a writer primarily.
And that is actually where we know each other from. At the time, I was working for Mayor Madden for the city of Troy. And I remember you starting, and you're going to laugh, but your video story on parking problems in downtown
Yeah.
Troy created such a headache for us for months, if not longer, just because it really hammered down on the impression of like parking deserts in downtown Troy. So I had to laugh. I had to bring it up.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's funny because I did that story so early in my time at the business review. I truly had like no idea of like, yeah, what impact that might have, or I don't know. I just think I was so green and new to Troy. I was just like, yeah, why not do this story? And the also funny thing about that now is I've come so far from I think that viewpoint of the city of Troy where now I'm like, we need less parking and I don't have a car. I get around primarily by bike. So now I'm like totally different on my perspective of urbanism too. So it's really funny to look back on that story.
Just to jump back to the book itself, and you've got a copy there in the background. I was really interested on the front cover of the book itself. Is that photo from somewhere specific? What was behind the selection of that particular photo?
The photo isn't anywhere specific as far as I know. When we were designing the cover, it was really cool as a process for me. We got a bunch of different options. Most of them involved some kind of either like vintage scouting imagery, or there were a couple more generic, just like outdoor pictures. And this was the one that I was really attracted to. I thought the photo, even though I don't know where it's taken actually, and I'm not even sure that it's a Boy Scout program happening in the front. It just looks like kind of a generic camp out. Just felt like really the right vibe. I loved the color scheme. It felt like the right type of cover for a nonfiction book. So I landed on it really early in the process, and we hardly made any changes to it, but I still love it.
Like what you hear? Well, then it might be time to give us a flattering review. Reviews are the best way to make the magical podcast algorithm suggest our modest little podcast to other listeners. If you're feeling extra generous, please share this episode with a friend, family member, or that special person in your life. They'll thank you for it, and we will be forever in your debt. Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City, streaming everywhere you get your podcasts. We touched on this earlier. Just recently, the Boy Scouts of America announced it was changing its name to Scouting America. And I was reading all of the press coverage about it, the national press coverage, NPR, New York Times, etc. And what really jumped out at me was the language and the press statements and the interviews from scouting leaders who are now in support of the change. This now probably close to going on 10 years,
Mhm. Yep.
if not more, from the original policy change to allow youth and then adult leaders back into the program. And those statements, how they juxtapose against the decades of resistance from Boy Scouts of America to embrace inclusion. What was your takeaway from that?
It's funny when I was actually out having lunch at the Whistling Kettle in Troy when the news broke, and I remember pulling out my phone and just having this like avalanche of text messages. And when I say I truly did not see it coming, that's true. So I was surprised, really pleasantly surprised. I think it is a signal that, like you said, scouting leadership is finally embracing this inclusivity. It's worth noting girls have been a part of the organization for 5 years already. There's thousands of female Eagle Scouts. And so the overall name Boy Scouts of America really was pretty confusing. And I think they probably took too long to make this change. But something that strikes me about the press coverage, you're right to say that the leadership is embracing this kind of broad idea of inclusivity, but they almost always anchor it in the inclusivity of girls specifically, right? They're saying now this is a co-ed program, it's boys and girls, we're embracing that. And that's all true. What they are often less eager to brag about is that kids of all genders are now allowed. That includes trans kids, non-binary kids, and they're often less explicit about that embrace, and even just about the embrace of gay people still. They're still a little bit squeamish about that publicly. So yes, they're embracing it in this broad sense, but I think there are still specific challenges for different groups. that the Boy Scouts isn't always as keen to address.
You sort of mentioned this earlier too, the social issues that have are now sort of more fraught in the eyes of today's political climate. And it seems that with each iteration of the Boy Scouts embrace of broader inclusion, it seems to get less and less attention. But
Hmm.
we've seen more recently this sort of uptick in like, oh geez, the Boy Scouts have gone woke,
Hmm.
which is kind of like the hollow knock against any organization, any person, any human being
Hmm.
embracing other human beings for who they are. For someone that is so deeply immersed in this specific facet of the LGBTQ movement, documenting it, I should say, but also as a queer person
Hmm.
yourself, what's your sort of take on that? And are you comfortable sharing a take?
Totally. Yeah. These things are really, really cyclical. That's what I've learned from being immersed in the history. The language that is being used now, woke is a new term, but like so much of the other language is straight out of the 70s. The protect our children rhetoric, this whole idea of like keep it out of the schools. It is so cyclical, and they've really barely even changed it. I think one thing that's different now is that it's somewhat less focused on cisgender gay people and more focused on trans people specifically. But really, it's an attack on the whole community. And like when they're done demonizing trans people, they're gonna start demonizing cisgender gay people again, I think. So it's just so cyclical, which I think is in one way depressing because it keeps coming back. In another way, it kind of gives me a little bit of hope because like I know that it's going to pass again. I know that even some of this anti-LGBTQ legislation that has been building over the past few years, even that's starting to lose traction. I saw recently that every single one of 20 bills in the state of Georgia all failed this year. All but one of, I think, 20 something bills in Florida failed this year. So I think we're starting to see it lose steam a little bit, which I think is good news for an organization like the Boy Scouts, which has, to their credit, managed to not roll back policies, to not really backpedal at all on inclusion. I think that's maybe part of why they're reticent to like bring it up. As I mentioned earlier, they don't want to draw attention to some of those things. But at the end of the day, those policies, the inclusionary policies, still exist despite this new cycle of backlash. So I think it's hopeful in the sense that it's not going to last forever.
Yeah, and even from a local perspective here in Troy, I was fortunate enough to work for Mayor Madden, who had appointed the first female deputy mayor, but he also had appointed the first gay deputy mayor in
Hmm.
Troy's history, a member of the LGBT community, which you have to kind of laugh that that was 2016 through
Yeah.
2024. That's when those sorts of things happened. And the current deputy mayor is a member of the LGBTQ community in the new administration. Um,
Hmm.
but on the flip side of the coin, just this last week, the city council, the Troy City Council, voted to issue, the boilerplate standard LGBTQ Pride Month proclamation,
Hmm.
and yet one council member, unfortunately, my council member up here that represents Lansingburg, voted no. And
Hmm.
in 2024, I try not to get mad about it. It's just supremely disappointing. I bring that up because it's frustrating to me and it's a very
Hmm.
specific issue.
Yeah, I share that frustration for sure. I think what I take a little bit of comfort in is, again, I think that really is a small but loud minority. And even in the scouting context, like the vast majority of people I encounter are really happy and excited about LGBTQ inclusion. The challenges are more around like, how do we do it? And like, how do we make kids feel welcome? And there's seemingly a lot less conversation about like, should we do it? So I think there's always going to be a few people who are upset. I have a Google alert for Boy Scouts of America, and I was just scanning all the headlines about the new name change. And again, like 90% of them are positive, and then there's like, Breitbart and Fox News and like the Daily Caller who are upset. So it really is a small number.
Right, as if they've been writing about the Boy Scouts. I
Yeah. Yeah, they've chosen to be upset very briefly and then they'll forget about it.
don't know if you had a chance to look at those links I sent
I
you.
did. I just read them. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that not wild?
That's incredible. I had no idea. I love when Troy has a place in like bigger history.
So there was a Troy record column, a two-piece column actually from Don Rittner. He is a local historian. He's written a number of books on Troy, local history. And this was from December of 2023. And it's a story. The column is called Troy and the Boy Scouts, and it's part one and two. And it starts with chances are everyone knows a Boy Scout or two. And he starts talking about the birth of the Boy Scouts organization, but he goes on to say, so who is the first official Boy Scout leader? On September 19th, 1910, only 3 months after the Scouts became official, Simon F. Lester of Troy, New York, became the very first person to hold the scouting leadership position of Scoutmaster that was approved by the BSA. End quote. That is unbelievably wild.
So cool. So cool. I think it's almost not that surprising to me because the Boy Scouts used to be headquartered in New York City, which I think people also often forget. So, yeah, it's amazing that it was established in this state, that the first Scoutmaster was within the state, within our city. I think that's really, really incredible. And it's another reason to like really appreciate Troy history and Don Rittner, who is just an incredible historian that we have here.
I found it more interesting that said during the 3 weeks in July 1910, he led a group of 63 boys at Camp Ilium in Pownell, Vermont, which makes it even more interesting. Obviously, Troy's name derived from Ilium. Historic
Hmm.
Ilium was, Troy is. So again, really fascinating. And the point that you just made, thinking of how old Troy is, how long Troy has been around, 200 plus years, it almost does make sense that, of course,
Right.
every every facet of like modern American history has some sort of root back through Troy in
Yeah.
in some way. And it said Troy Lester lived at 107th Avenue in Lansingburg and worked for the YMCA on First Street in Troy. So that was, I thought, was really cool. In addition to the first Boy Scout leader being appointed in Troy, uh, Charles M. Connolly from Troy, who was the individual behind the design of the Arrow Collar Man, which was to promote the collar shirts, aka the Collar City. He was also the individual that was responsible for designing the Boy Scout uniform and the Boy Scout patches, which is also
Yeah, that's more unbelievable to me, actually. Even knowing Troy's place in, I guess, garment history, I really figured they would have hired someone at the headquarters or something. I'm surprised that it was just this guy in Troy who had his hands all over the first uniform.
and I bring it up just because it's so incredible. Here you are, you've written this really deep dive into Boy Scout history, and these two totally unknown sort of pieces of Boy Scout history intersect with Troy history. And here we are in a Troy centric podcast talking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's special that for me that I wrote this book, almost entirely in Troy. I actually still remember the first day I put pen to paper, so to speak. I brought my laptop to the little pocket park on First and Congress across from Stage Park, and they have those little bistro tables, and I sat down and started writing the very first chapter of the book. And I think I was at the farmer's market earlier, and then I like sat down to start writing because it was a beautiful day. And, many, 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 many thousands of words were written right here where we're recording in this office in Troy. So it's really cool to have that connection.
Got a question? Have a suggestion? We want to hear from you. Drop us a line at mail@troystorypod.com. You can always find us on social media, including YouTube, Instagram, Threads, Facebook, TikTok, and even the digital wasteland known as X, formerly Twitter. We often ask each guest about their Troy experience. You are a homeowner here in Troy. Your place currently is just around the corner from my old apartment, which was really funny when you sent me the address. I had to laugh. But we ask each guest how they enjoy Troy. So, how do you enjoy Troy? Obviously, as a homeowner now, but is there specific places you like to go? Is there specific things you like to do? Are there certain events that you really
Mhm.
enjoy? Are you a glutton for punishment? Do you like to go to city council meetings or other government events, or just to dive a little bit into how you enjoy Troy?
I enjoy Troy in so many ways. Attending government meetings is unfortunately not one of them, but but just yesterday I was at the farmers market, which I go to, every week if I'm in town. It's just still a delight even after all these years. I mean, I've been here for about 7 years. It's not that long. But when I moved here, the first thing they showed me in Troy was the farmers market. That was my first ever experience of the city. And 7 years later, it still delights me every week. And it's so great to be able to walk around a city and run into so many people and recognize so many people. I moved here from Boston, and I remember one of the first things that really hit me was just that small town vibe and really enjoying like that aspect of it, that I could know the business owners and really feel like a part of a community. Yeah, I think that increased when I bought a house here. Definitely had more skin in the game. There was a lot of frustration that came with that too, but it was mostly a positive experience. And now I just like to really hang out at my favorite spots. Jacob Alejandro is one of my favorite coffee shops. There's so many restaurants here, too many to name, that I enjoy. So that's something that Troy constantly gives me, is just like this daily life that is so pleasant and so accessible and walkable and all the rest.
What are your favorite farmers market vendors?
The Placid Baker is by far my favorite. I get a pastry from them every single week. I've got a couple of friends that are vendors actually. So my friend Jeff makes leather goods that he sells at the market. So I always stop by his stall. Um, some of the other bakers, I really love baked goods. So I hit up a lot of the bakers. Placid Bakers is my favorite though, probably.
Ditto. Placid Baker is a must stop, even if it's just for the pretzels. That's
Yeah, definitely.
I see you're taking the book out on the promotional tour, the proverbial out on the road. Uh,
hmm
that includes some local events, but it also looks like some scouting specific events too. Can you kind of get into what the plans are for promoting the book?
Yeah, my book tour will hit about a dozen different cities, and it starts right here in Troy. I'm really thrilled that my book launch is happening on June 4th at Market Block Books at 4 p.m. That's my hometown bookstore, my favorite bookstore, so I'm thrilled to be able to do that. And then the next day, I hit the road. So the first leg of the tour, as it were, is mostly in the Northeast. I'll be doing Providence, Rhode Island, Boston, New York, DC, Philly. And then I've got some other further afield stops that are spread throughout the summer. So I'll be hitting up Chicago, I'll be hitting up New Jersey and Colorado. And so the Colorado event is, I think, the one you're alluding to. It's not part of a scouting event, although the Boy Scouts are having a national conference in Boulder at the end of July. So I'll be doing an event in town at the same time, hoping that some folks will come by while they're there.
Boulder's a great city and Colorado's a great state. I've been there a bunch of times. That I'm sure that's going to be really exciting and enjoyable.
I've never been to Boulder, but I imagine there's a lot of former scouts there, given how outdoorsy it is.
What was the process for shopping the book around? Was this something that just came up organically? Did you start writing a book and then you had like I know you talked
hmm
very briefly you decided to write one, but what was what's the process behind getting a book published as like sort of an independent writer and journalist like yourself?
The process is very long and winding. So I started writing the book with basically no knowledge of how the publishing industry worked. I just started writing a couple chapters, and it wasn't until I attended a conference actually where there was a session about nonfiction books that it kind of all clicked into place for me and I understood what the steps actually were. So the big step is really you have to write this thing called a book proposal, which includes a few sample chapters, all this other stuff, and that's kind of your key to the publishing industry. So once I had that, I embarked on trying to find an agent, which was definitely the hardest part of the process. Literary agents are pretty much necessary if you want to be traditionally published, which I did. So there was a lot of cold emailing, mostly just no responses or rejections. And I managed to finally get an agent through a professional connection. So a mentor of mine, former professor who is also an author, he's got a quote on the jacket of the book. he put me in touch with his agent, and I was lucky enough that his agent liked it and took me on. So that was the biggest hurdle in this whole process. After that, we kind of workshopped the proposal a little bit and started sending it out to publishers, which was definitely a nerve-wracking process. I'm really, really happy with the publisher I ended up with. On our very first phone call, I felt like my editor immediately understood what I was trying to do with the book. She didn't take any convincing, which was really awesome. So I've been thrilled with everyone who's been part of my publishing journey, my agent, my editor, my publicist. Everyone's been really great and has really believed in the book. But that all took a very long time. As I mentioned, I started writing the book in 2019. I got an agent in 2021. The book contract was in 22. Then it took another 2 years for it to come out. So a long road.
If people are interested in getting their hands on a copy of the book, or they want to listen to the Morally Straight podcast, where can they go?
Yeah, you can buy the book anywhere books are sold, as they say, but the best landing page for all of this is morallystraightbook.com. When you go there, you'll find links to buy the book. I even have some queer-owned bookstores you can patronize. There's the entire book tour schedule. You can link out to the newsletter and the podcast. So that's really the one-stop shop for everything.
Mike, thank you so much. This was such an enjoyable conversation. I have been looking forward to doing this with you for quite some time since we first started emailing me. Life tends to come full circle sometimes. It's really always funny to find out somebody else is an Eagle Scout and go, oh, right.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely.
Now I understand. Now,
Yep.
Mike Socio, he is the author of Morally Straight, How the Fight for LGBTQ plus Inclusion Changed the Boy Scouts and America. So if you're listening to this podcast now, you can head over to his website if you're interested in finding a copy of the book. Mike, thank you so much. This was so much fun.
I had a blast, John. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much to Mike for taking time out of his schedule to discuss his new book and provide unique insight on the complicated history of the Boy Scouts and the LGBTQ community. It was a very long conversation, but that's what happens when you get two Eagle Scouts together to talk about scouting. If you want to get your hands on a copy of Mike's new book, visit morallystraightbook.com. Don't forget, you can also visit troystorypod.com to find an archive of previous episodes and to sign up for email updates. We promise not to spam you. As always, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on whatever streaming service you're using to ensure you get notified about upcoming chapters of Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City. Until next time, love yourself, love one another, and may Pod save Troy. Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City, is hosted, written, edited, and produced by me, John Salka. Our theme music is by Stephen J. Goldman at Four Legs Records. Like what you heard? Please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City. This is incredibly helpful for getting others to find our show. Want to know more? Visit troystorypod.com to see upcoming episodes, guests, and bonus content. Thanks for listening. The views or opinions expressed by guests are their own and not of the host or Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City.